So here's something most people overlook. Chewing one clove a day for about a week can begin to shift inflammation, microbial balance, and even blood sugar signaling in a way that you can actually feel. This is something I see quite a bit, especially in women who feel like their body is suddenly more reactive, where inflammation lingers longer, recovery takes more time, and small issues seem to build instead of resolve. And what's interesting is that sometimes the shift doesn't come from something complex. It comes from restoring signals the body is already designed to use. Cloves contain a compound called eugenol, and this is where things start to get interesting. Eugenol acts as a signaling molecule in the body, especially around inflammation and nerve response. That's why people have traditionally used it for tooth discomfort, because it interacts with pain pathways in a way that feels very immediate. But the stronger effect is not just pain relief. It's how that same compound begins to influence inflammatory signaling more systemically. And over time, that matters more than most people realize, because inflammation in midlife doesn't always show up as something obvious. It tends to show up as joint stiffness that lingers, slower recovery after workouts, or that low-level swelling that never fully resolves. And this is where compounds like eugenol can begin to shift that pattern. There's also another layer here that often gets missed. Cloves have strong antimicrobial properties, but instead of simply wiping things out, it appears to interfere with the function of certain microbes. One way it does this is by disrupting biofilms. These are protective layers that bacteria form around themselves. And when those layers stay intact, your immune system has a harder time fully clearing what doesn't belong. So instead of just killing bacteria, the body begins to recognize and clear them more effectively. And that's a very different process. This becomes especially relevant if you've noticed things like bloating that comes and goes, or digestion that feels inconsistent, because microbial balance plays a much bigger role in energy and metabolism than most people think. And this connects to another effect that often gets attention. Cloves can begin to support blood sugar regulation, not in a dramatic way, but in a signaling way, which is often more important. Because insulin resistance doesn't usually show up all at once. It builds quietly. It shows up as energy dips after meals, cravings that feel harder to control, or weight that shifts even when habits haven't changed. And what's happening underneath is that cells are becoming less responsive to insulin. That signal is just not being heard as clearly. Certain compounds in clove appear to help improve that sensitivity, so the same signal starts working again. And when that happens, energy tends to feel more stable. This is where many women first notice subtle changes. Not dramatic weight loss, but steadier energy. Less of that mid-afternoon drop. A different relationship with food. And that's usually the beginning of a deeper shift. There are also digestive effects worth paying attention to. Cloves can stimulate digestive enzymes, and that tends to reduce things like gas and bloating fairly quickly. So if your digestion feels slower than it used to, or meals seem to sit heavier, this is one of those small inputs that can make a noticeable difference. It also has a high antioxidant capacity. And while that term is often used, it really means that it helps buffer oxidative stress. Because as we move through midlife, the balance between damage and repair starts to shift. The body still repairs, but not as efficiently. And over time, that gap becomes more noticeable. This is where support matters. Not to override the body, but to reinforce what it's already trying to do. There's also a mild effect on circulation. Cloves can influence blood flow and reduce the tendency toward clot formation. And while this is subtle, it reflects a broader pattern of how these compounds interact with multiple systems at once. not in isolation, but in coordination. And that's really the key to understanding why something this simple can feel different in your body. Because it's not about one isolated benefit, it's about how multiple small shifts begin to align. Inflammation becomes quieter. Digestion becomes more efficient. Energy becomes more stable. And over time, those changes start to compound. Now, in terms of how to use it, the simplest approach is just chewing one whole clove daily. That allows the compound to be released gradually. Some people prefer to grind it into food or add it to a smoothie. Others may use clove oil topically for localized discomfort. But the key is consistency, not intensity. Because what you're really doing here is giving the body a repeated signal. And over time, the body responds to that signal. This is something I often remind patients. The body is always adapting. The question is what signals it's adapting to. And when you start introducing inputs that support regulation instead of stress, things begin to shift in a more sustainable way. Not all at once, but in a direction that feels more stable. And that's where this becomes less about a remedy and more about understanding how your body is responding beneath the surface. If you want to understand what your body is actually doing, visit DNA Wellness and Longevity Institute. We help people understand what their body is doing and why it is responding the way it is. If you feel older than you should, or you are not seeing the changes you expect, we can help you identify what is holding your body back. Visit our website at defynaturalaging.com.